Steve's life was organized around a strict schedule. Planning helped him keep up with everything, and perhaps even achieve such great heights in business. He woke up early, went to the gym, attended pre-scheduled meetings in the office, and met with business partners. Even his dates with his fiancée Rena were held on Tuesdays, Saturdays, and occasionally on Thursdays, until she moved in with him. In general, everything in Steve's life fit into the lines of his journal, succumbing to its rhythm and making his life rich and organized at the same time. But none of the pages of his expensive leather-bound diary said that Steve would break away from an important meeting to bury his younger sister he had loved infinitely. Steve stared out the airplane window, not really noticing the cotton candy-like clouds. His thoughts were far from the cabin of the airplane, which was flying to his hometown. They were taking him back in time. How long had he been away from his homeland? 2 years, he thought. But he had no warm feelings about the place. The only thing that brought him back year after year was grief. First, he had quarrelled with his parents when he was still a boy. They dreamed of making a dentist out of their son, but he wasn't going to pull someone's fillings, not even for a lot of money. Besides, Steve just hated his town. Maybe for some people it was a beautiful place, but he hated everything about it. Its nauseating routine, its greyness, and its quiet streetcars. He longed in body and soul for the metropolis, for a place where he could realize his potential. Of course, his parents were afraid to let their son out of the nest at the age of 18. But Steve just packed his things, left a note, and left to build a career. He settled at a friend's place, started working part-time, and made peace with his parents after a year. But they could still not accept their son's choice and could not forgive his escape. Fortunately, Steve made the right decision. He had a gift for understanding cars and also had a business vein that inexplicably manifested in his character. He deftly made the correct connections and in 4 years secured sponsor support to build his own company. More precisely, a specialized store selling automotive parts, components, and consumables for cars of any brand. Then the business began to grow like yeast. 1 auto parts store turned into 2, then into 3, and then into 8. Car service stations and gas stations opened under the brand. Recently, he even started organizing races for drift fans and exhibitions of tuned cars, considering it the best advertising for his network of stores. But behind all the turmoil of business, he forgot about his family. As soon as Steve became successful, he faithfully helped his parents. He sent them money, called them on holidays, and invited them to his house. But they just waved him off. Once he dragged them and his sister to the city, but they did not like the turmoil of the city, which resembled a beehive. At the age of 28, Steve felt that his life was perfect. However, fate had different plans for him. In the fall of that year, Steve's mother passed away due to pneumonia. By the time Steve arrived at the hospital, it was already too late to say goodbye. The tragedy brought Steve and his father closer together, but not for long. The death of his wife had a profound effect on the man, and he soon followed her to the grave. At the time, Meg had just turned 18, but she categorically refused to move to her brother. Steve did not insist, acknowledging that she was capable of living on her own. "If you think that I cannot cope on my own, you are very wrong. I've lived somehow here without you all these years, and I will be able to continue." The girl grumbled then, putting her hands in her sides and looking at her brother, who was frowning strongly at that moment, reminding her of their mother. By the way, many students move to dorms in other cities and even countries for education, and I have my university close to my apartment. I have a scholarship here. Steve tried to explain that he could help her transfer to an even better university, but his sister remained stubborn as a sheep. In the end, Steve gave up and supported his sister in every way possible. Despite this, they rarely saw each other in person, communicating mostly through video calls. Steve could not leave his business, and Meg was committed to her university studies and her friends. Steve vaguely felt that a guy was involved in her death, but she didn't introduce him and only waved her hand when Steve asked. The last time Meg came to him was this summer in August. He had invited her to stay for the summer. In June, Meg finished her 4th year at the university, specializing in veterinary science. Steve paid for her tickets to the city and all the entertainment, spoiling his younger sister with pleasure. He had to take days out of his busy schedule to give time to his sister. True, Meg was still unusually quiet and thoughtful, but she excused herself, saying that she was exhausted from exams. Steve's fiancée was also unusually grumpy at that time. Rena seemed to be jealous of her fiancé's younger sister, angry that he spent so much time and energy on her. Yes, she and Meg had never gotten along. The girl called Rena witch or cheap actress. Meg always wrinkled her nose and rolled her eyes when her brother's fiancée opened her mouth and made one of her high-minded comments. For example, about Steve's sister's tastes, appearance or hairstyle. Steve only waved them off. Girls, they'll figure it out for themselves. He was not going to once again explain to his fiancée that he only had Meg left in this world. Now, he only regretted that he hadn't spent enough time with Meg, or that he hadn't left her at all in his city. "Drinks, sir?" There was a polite voice of a stewardess nearby. "Wine, perhaps? Juice? Water?" Steve turned, meeting his gaze with a pretty blonde in a red uniform, cap and neck scarf. She smiled charmingly at the passenger with her rehearsed smile, holding a bottle of wine in her hands and already preparing to fill the man's glass. "No, thank you." Steve shook his head, turning to the window again. Since the beginning of the flight, they had been trying hard to get him drunk with champagne or feed him appetizers. Only he couldn't get a bite. In front of his eyes was his sister's face from the last time they had seen each other. It was at the airport. He remembered how Meg had hesitated to say goodbye to him. She had been stepping from foot to foot. "Steve," she started, raising her eyes to him, "you know, I want to say—" But suddenly a woman's voice from the speakers announced the boarding of her flight, and Meg stopped saying more. "You were going to say something?" Steve reminded the girl. She sighed and smiled, strained. "Well, forget it. Not a big deal. We'll talk more later. Bye, my big brother." The man hugged his sister, whose head barely reached his shoulder. She ran to the terminal, turning back and waving. "See ya." The man waved her off, not even realizing she'd lied. They wouldn't see each other again. After their meeting, the girl disappeared. She dropped out of her brother's life, citing employment, workload at the university, and God knows what else. And then he had a call, but it wasn't his sister. Steve wrinkled his nose and closed his tired eyelids. It was like sand had been poured into his eyes. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept. When he'd gotten the call, he'd thought it was a cruel and ridiculous joke. Girls in their 20s can't leave this world, especially not a bright, sweet one like Meg. It's too cruel. Maybe it was wrong to think that way, but Steve's mind was still stubbornly filled with gloomy thoughts. The prisons are full of bad people who live off the taxes of ordinary people. So why do the young and kind people die? Where is justice? Even now, when Steve had checked everything 1,000 times and was already flying to the appointed place to identify his sister, he hoped that it was a mistake. With these thoughts, Steve did not notice how the plane landed. He didn't remember when he buckled up, how he answered the stewardess's questions, or how he had caught a cab. And then finally, Steve was looking into Meg's motionless white face. Her eyelids were forever closed, and her lips were no longer smiling. The investigator explained what had happened. The girl had been killed in a traffic accident. It was dark outside. The city was covered in snow and the roads were icy. The driver lost control and hit her in a crosswalk. He swore that the girl herself jumped under the wheels, taking a step in front of the car. Steve did not believe in this story. However, he understood that something was wrong with his sister. Meg had dropped out of university when she returned from him. She'd given up the profession she'd dreamed of, and she hadn't even told her brother about it. But that wasn't all the news that fell on the grieving man. Steve was asked to visit the children's hospital. What was he to do there? However, he did not resist when they put him in a car and drove him there. They were met by a middle-aged doctor in a white coat. He confidently led Steve behind him through the corridors of the hospital, examining something as he went and gesticulating vigorously. Steve tried, but could not grasp the thread of his narrative. Meg's frozen face was still in front of Steve's eyes like a mask. Her daughter was born prematurely, so there may be problems. Now she needs special care. The doctor continued talking, confidently leading Steve behind him. Steve rubbed his face with his palms, trying to erase the fatigue and shock, but to no avail. "Whose daughter?" he asked, still not understanding anything. "Your sister's daughter," the doctor replied calmly. "She was 8 months pregnant, in her 34th obstetric week. You knew that, didn't you?" Steve nodded hesitantly, then shook his head negatively. I saw her this summer. She didn't tell me anything." Steve remembered his sister's confused face when they said goodbye. Maybe that's what she wanted to say. And then he invited her to Christmas, but she said that she had already agreed with her friends. And she said something about her diploma. Apparently she was lying and hiding her pregnancy. But why? He would never condemn her. On the contrary, he would support her. As if through absorbent cotton came the doctor's reasoning. "The child was saved. It's a real miracle due to the situation. But you realize that the younger the age of the child in the womb, the higher the risk of severe pathologies. It largely depends on the health of the mother. This baby is weak. There's an increased risk of apnea, so we'll keep her in the hospital for now. But if there are no complications, you can take her home." "Home?" Steve echoed in disbelief. "Yes, with you," nodded the doctor, checking something in his documents. "You, as an uncle and the only relative, should take care of the baby. Your name is on your sister's papers." Steve blinked, furrowing his eyebrows. Had he become an uncle? And now he was supposed to take care of the baby. But how? He didn't even know what diapers were. In fact, he had never even thought about having kids. Rena said right away that even after marriage, she wouldn't stop taking birth control pills. The girl worked as a model, dreamed of becoming an actress, and certainly did not plan to give birth. And other people's children annoyed her, causing neither emotion nor maternal instinct. Steve treated it normally, as he himself was not into children. He was a businessman, absorbed by the frantic pace of the megalopolis. And he was sure that everything would come with time. That one day he would have an heir was obvious to him, but that it would happen so suddenly he certainly did not expect. Meanwhile, the doctor, not realizing the turmoil going on in Steve's mind, had already pushed open the door to one of the wards. The baby was sleeping peacefully. She was quite tiny. It seemed that she could fit into Steve's palm. He wiped the sweat off his forehead, looking at the baby. "Damn it!" he swore out loud, eliciting a displeased look from the doctor. "I'm sorry, it's just... this is so unexpected." "You can give up the baby," the doctor said immediately. "Keep her here, then she'll be sent to an orphanage. We've already notified the child welfare authorities. That's the rules." Steve swallowed the lump in his throat. Leave his sister's daughter here, the only thing left of her, He did not dare even think of such a thing. No, of course not. But what am I supposed to do now? Hire a nanny, right? That's not a problem. I'll pay any money, Steve said, relieved that he was starting to feel everything under control again. It's okay, I can handle it. It's just a child. The doctor nodded, supporting his idea. Yes, that's a good idea, but I suggest you hire an experienced nanny, preferably one with a medical background. And her father? Steve asked. That I don't know, the doctor said, shaking his head. Do not delay visiting child welfare authorities. For now she will remain under our supervision. Steve nodded and looked at the child one more time. The little girl was quiet, not moving at all. Steve was even frightened. Was she breathing at all? But suddenly the baby girl opened her mouth to yawn, and the man calmed down. So the whirlwind of events in Steve's life began. Organising the funeral and registering custody of the child were expedited thanks to the man's connections. Meanwhile, a major deal with a foreign partner was in danger of failure. By the end of his forced vacation, Steve was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. When he arrived at the maternity hospital to pick up his niece, he realised too late that he had not found a nanny. He had no time to organise a casting. Steve dialed the secretary's number, wishing to entrust the search for a candidate to her, but the line was constantly busy. When he reached the right ward, the man froze in the doorway. A young nurse was cooing over his niece, mumbling some kind of counting rhyme or nursery rhyme as she deftly handled the child. Her movements were precise and confident. 1, 2, 3, and the baby was already tightly wrapped in a diaper. He didn't need Sherlock's mind to realise that this girl had a medical background and could be an excellent nanny for his niece. Steve trusted himself, and now he had the same feeling he had when he felt that a good idea was waiting for him. The man put his smartphone in his pocket, resolutely entering the room. "Do you want to change your place of work?" Steve asked, instead of greeting. The nurse flinched in fear, holding the baby close and turning to face the guest. She had light blonde hair, blue eyes, slender facial features, and a sharp chin. She was beautiful. "What?" she questioned, looking at Steve as if he were a patient in a mental institution rather than someone wearing an expensive suit. Steve decided to start over. The past few days had made him nervous and robbed him of his communication skills. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. My name is Steve Barrow, and I'm this baby's uncle." The nurse's eyes opened wider, fluttering with curved lashes, untouched by mascara. And then those eyes filled with pity. "Oh, so you're here for Zoe, right?" the nurse asked. "Zoe?" Steve marvelled. The nurse looked away, blushing deeply. "Well, I had to name her somehow, but of course you can give her another name." He hadn't thought of that. "Listen, what's your name?" he asked. "Faith," the nurse said, cradling the baby back to sleep in her arms. "Faith Hagen." "Faith, nice to meet you. The thing is, I have to leave for my city, and the baby needs care, which I know nothing about. I don't have time to find a nanny, and you seem to fulfill your duties quite conscientiously, and Zoe seems to be very pleased with your care. I swear I can't even hold her in my arms. I'll crush her." The nurse barely smiled, but then gathered herself again. "What are you getting at?" Steve sighed heavily. "I'm offering you a job and good money, Faith. Big money, which you will not earn here. Just come with me to my city and take care of Zoe. I have a big house, and you'll have a private room." Steve felt that he needed her, with her blue eyes and blonde braid. He felt in his heart that he could trust her with his little niece. To his pleasant surprise, the girl did not say a decisive no to such a strange offer. He thought he would have to insist, but she pressed her lips together, asking cautiously, "How much are you going to pay the nanny?" "You name any figure," Steve promised. "Give me a figure. We'll discuss it and come to an agreement. I can negotiate with the head doctor too, so they'll let you go." Steve wasn't lying. He was going to pay any money just to take some of the responsibility for the baby off his shoulders. "I've heard about you," Faith said, looking affectionately at the sleeping infant. Then she turned her gaze to Steve. "I need money," she confesses, looking at him resolutely. "And I need your help. Currently." The businessman answered, smiling broadly and holding out his palm to her in a businesslike manner. "So, we need each other. Deal?" Faith carefully handed over the baby and put her small palm into Steve's hand, saying, "Deal." The man squeezed it lightly, completing a successful transaction. Business sense never deceived Steve, and he was sure that by trusting his intuition now, he had not made a mistake. But the man could not even guess what changes would be brought about by the touch of their hands. When the cab driver stopped the white Lexus in front of the 2-story mansion, Steve frowned. A light burn was in each of the panoramic windows on the first floor. Faith was sitting in the back seat with the baby. She was pale after the flight. Although the journey itself did not last long, it was the first flight of her life, and besides, she was terribly worried about how the baby would tolerate it. Fortunately, everything went well. Zoe slept the whole way, not particularly interested in clouds or turbulence. Steve was also tired, and now he dreamed of only one thing: drinking a glass of whiskey and collapsing into bed. However, the house greeted him not with the cozy silence, but with the sounds of music. "Are you having a party?" Faith asked the man as they entered the spacious hall. "Must be," Steve said uncertainly. There were 24 people around: models, actors, bloggers. The air was filled with the aromas of expensive perfumes, in a strange combination with the smells of exotic dishes that the hostess treated the guests to. Although Steve hung out around in such society, he had never been a full part of it. He learned to smile at them and to say the right words at the right people, but he likes working in his garage much better. Looking at the designer clothes of the guests, the glitter of their diamonds and their fake smiles, he often compared this ostentatious gloss to a layer of gilding or expensive paint applied to the surface of a car to hide corrosion. And now Steve, tired from the flight and the last few days, didn't understand what was going on in his house, especially at such a difficult moment for him. Fortunately, the answer itself found him. Rena, having noticed the groom, emerged from the crowd, thin and graceful, with a glass of wine in her hand. The massive engagement ring was visible to everyone. She had chosen it herself, not entrusting such a job to Steve. Noticing the bride's smile, Steve mentally scowled. Since she received the coveted engagement ring, rejoicing like Gollum and almost calling the jewellery "my precious," she began to demonstrate to others her position. The model tried to show herself as the mistress of the house, and this ring was evidently another act of displaying her sense of ownership. "Steve!" she exclaimed, wrapping her arms around the groom's neck so as not to spill the Prosecco. "Oh, I missed you so much, darling." "And you couldn't cope with boredom alone," Steve said jealously, "and you invited the closest people to support you, right?" Not that he was against such parties, but now it was such a bad time. He didn't understand how Rena hadn't thought of it herself. He didn't come back from Bali, but from a funeral. And tomorrow would be Monday, with a meeting with the German delegation. Rena gave him a playful peck on the cheek, but then her gaze stopped at Faith and Zoe. The little baby was already awake and ready to cry. Her face gradually wrinkled and reddened. "Who the hell is this?" The blonde squinted, looking at the strangers and the bags with children's things. "Faith and Zoe. They'll be living with us," the man said, trying to remember why he hadn't informed his fiancée earlier. However, he himself had only met Zoe 2 days ago. Rena's mouth with scarlet lipstick, hung open. She looked at Steve, expecting him to laugh and say that he was joking. Yet Steve had already turned away from his bride upon hearing the child begin to whimper. "I'll take you to your room. Only the children's furniture will be brought tomorrow. My secretary took care of everything," he said to Faith. She nodded and followed him. But the man had no sooner taken a step when Rena clung to him. "Are you kidding me? You went to another town and came back with a girl and a baby, and you think you can leave without explaining everything to me, don't you?" The words were rude, but Steve realized that the situation was beyond normal. He should have talked to his bride earlier. He took her hand and touched her fingers with his lips. "I'll come back in a couple of minutes and we'll talk, okay?" he said, and without waiting for her answer, he nodded to Faith. Steve gave Faith a room on the second floor with a private bathroom and a balcony. The man initially offered to put the baby in another room, but Faith refused, explaining that the infant should be watched at night. "You can freely walk around the house and use all the things. Don't be shy," he informed the nanny. "The food in the fridge is all yours. We rarely cook, but I'll order you breakfast. If you want to have dinner, then—" "I'm not hungry. I ate on the airplane." The girl waved away, beginning to undress the whimpering Zoe to change her diaper. The man looked at her confident movements and once again realized that he had made the right choice. Obviously, God himself had sent him this nurse. On the airplane, they had time to discuss their cooperation. He liked the girl even more. She was calm, polite, and ingenious. Faith mentioned that she needed money to help her family, but did not go into further detail, and Steve did not pry. Leaving Faith to take care of the baby and rest, Steve went downstairs to the ongoing party. Ignoring the greetings of the tipsy guests, he approached the bar and poured himself a drink. Rena, already holding a glass, immediately joined him, glaring angrily. Settling down in an armchair away from the epicenter of the fun, Steve explained the situation to his bride. Only Rena, who was already quite drunk, was not satisfied with this explanation. "This is not normal," she exclaimed. "I'm against it." In the kitchen, something shattered with a clang. Steve briefly covered his eyes, taking a deep breath. "I want your guests to leave, Rena. I need to rest," he said firmly, not wanting to argue. "Are your guests to leave too?" Angry and nodding towards the second floor, as if Faith were standing on the stairs. "The nanny and the baby will live here," Steve repeated. "But you didn't even consult me," Rena complained. "The house is big. If you'd like to, you won't even have to meet." Steve tried to calm her down. "Get them a hotel room," Rena demanded. "Do you want a baby to live in a hotel? Really?" Steve was incredulous. "Then a different apartment. Build them something in the backyard. I don't care what. I don't want to share this house with another woman. And anyway, a baby? Is the country out of orphanages? I used to start my day with yoga, massage, ambitions, and espresso. Not with baby crying, Steve." Music, other people's laughter, and a mixture of perfume made the businessman angry. Rena's hysteria was starting to get annoying. Shouldn't she be supporting him, freaking out as if he had brought a mistress and his baby into the house? But he brought the nurse and the sister's child. The sister died, and Rena didn't even ask how he felt after losing his last relative. "She's my child, Rena," Steve said decisively, clutching the glass. "She's mine from now on." Rena's face turned pale, and she compressed her lips, throwing angry glances in the direction of her fiancé. "Steve, this is not your child. Your sister gave birth, and we don't even know who the father is. How do we know what kind of heredity the baby has? Maybe she'll become a murderer, an alcoholic, or a drug addict. Who knows?" "Rena, don't overreact," the man said sharply. However, the young, angry woman did not hear him and continued to express her opinion. You should not take responsibility for the sins of others. And you can't make me accept this screaming and peeing under herself, poor little thing." Suddenly, Steve took a new look at his bride. He hadn't realized she disliked children so much. He thought that the girl was only worried about her figure and modelling career, but her words, directed at the baby, were filled with so much bile, it was unthinkable. "I'm not forcing you, I'm asking you," Steve said, barely holding on to his self-control and taking a good sip of whiskey. "Get over it. I'm not asking you to take care of the baby. Just accept that I have Zoe now." Rena tensed up, clenching her fists and leaning forward. "No, Steve," she hissed like a snake, except that the white curls on her head did not stir. "Choose, either me or this little monster." Hearing such an ultimatum, Steve suddenly became enraged, as if a fuse had blown. He threw the glass into the wall, shattering it into many shards and leaving a wet trace of alcohol on the wallpaper. Rena gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Her eyes widened, expressing horror, as if the glass had shattered not against the wall, but against her pretty head of platinum curls. "Then get out!" the man bellowed. Steve looked at her tiredly and suddenly remembered how, during their recent quarrel, Rena had pretended to be a tragic heroine and, clasping her hands gracefully, spoke to him in a trembling, pathetic tone. She kept squinting at the mirror opposite, as if wondering what she looked like at that moment. He didn't understand why the hell she was doing that. Now he realized that the failed actress was acting out her feelings for him as if on stage. "What have you said?" Rena asked, her voice trembling and tears freezing in her eyes. "Go away, Rena." Steve rubbed his forehead, trying to calm his migraine. "And take this circus with you before they destroy my house. I have to get up early tomorrow." He got up and, without any more pointless arguments, went to his bedroom. He fell down without undressing on the coveted bed and almost instantly fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Steve realized he had overslept before he even opened his eyes. He felt it with his sixth sense, probably. His head still ached and fatigue stiffened his body, but he lifted himself out of bed with a sudden movement, glancing at his watch. "No," he groaned, resting his elbows on his knees and ruffling his hair with his fingers. He always kept to a schedule. He was never late. And now what? The man went out into the corridor and heard a child crying. He involuntarily grinned. The doctor had said that the child was sick, but her lungs were healthy. The sound did not last long, however. Although the man had no time to spare, he did not restrain his curiosity. He went down to the first floor, where the sounds were coming from. The nanny was in the kitchen. There were still traces of other people's merriment here, but the space was filled with the appetizing aroma of fresh pancakes. A small stack of them stood on the table. Steve's stomach even churned with the desire for breakfast. Faith stood in front of the wide window and looked at the flakes of snow. Zoe, in a clean bodysuit, was in her arms and drank baby formula from a bottle. "You see how beautiful it is outside?" Faith said to the child, admiring the snowy view. "If you eat and sleep well, we will go out with you often." The man rested his shoulder against the jamb, watching Faith. She chattered as if the baby understood her. Back on the airplane, after his remark, she'd looked at Steve indignantly and informed him that communicating with children was important. "Have you gotten used to the house?" Steve grinned, drawing attention to himself, and went to the coffee machine to pour himself a cup. The nurse turned around and nodded. The man appreciated that she was straightforward and used what was offered, despite her modest appearance. "Only I couldn't figure out this machine," muttered the girl resentfully as she looked at the coffee machine. Steve laughed and offered to show her how to use it. Having explained everything, he noticed that the time was rapidly disappearing. Did he allow himself to waste time like that before? No, but the unfamiliar feeling of domestic comfort that the young woman evoked made him want to linger longer. Perhaps it was because she was from his hometown, or maybe it was because she had his niece on her hands. After enjoying a couple of amazingly delicious pancakes, the man answered the babysitter's household questions, and after taking a shower, he rushed off to his meeting. He miraculously arrived on time, or maybe his partners were late. The meeting went well, and Steve's mood cheered up. He even thought of calling Rena to apologize for his behavior, but he changed his mind. The routine of work days dragged Steve back in, and he hadn't seen the nanny and the child all week, only asking on the phone if they were well. Faith's voice was always cheerful. It seemed she was enjoying life with the child, though Steve didn't understand what was good about it. On Friday, he arrived home well past midnight and heard Zoe crying in the bedroom. Passing by, he didn't dare knock so as not to embarrass the nanny, but he listened. Suddenly, he heard Faith singing. Her voice was gentle, soothing and sincere. Rena returned over the weekend. She caressed her fiancé, wrapped her arms around his neck, and covered his face with kisses. They began living together again, but it wasn't easy. Rena used any excuse to spite Faith or sting her with barbed words. "You have such an interesting look, Faith," she sneered, casting a contemptuous glance at the nanny, who was dressed in comfortable jeans and a grey t-shirt. "Was there a sale at the second-hand store?" "No, I'm wearing something from your closet. Don't you recognize it?" Faith smiled back, easily parrying the blow. It seemed that the girl was not affected by the antics of her employer's fiancé. She either responded with the same barb or ignored Rena, behaving decently and not crossing paths with her. Rena often wrinkled her pretty nose if the nanny and the baby appeared in the living room. "Something stinks here," sharply, she commented, taking a break from her smartphone. "You're the nanny. Are you even watching the baby? Maybe she needs her diaper changed." "Do you want to check its cleanliness?" Faith smiled politely, jokingly offering the well-groomed blonde to hold the drooling baby. Of course, such a prospect made the woman run far away from Faith and Zoe. Moreover, Rena always demonstratively plugged her ears if the baby whimpered or even hummed, and complained of headaches from the noise. However, Faith was sure that the main cause of her migraines were the noisy parties and the number of cocktails that she drank, not the baby. But what bothered Rena much more was that Steve, on the other hand, was comfortable in the presence of the nanny and the infant. If, at first, he did not come closer to Zoe than at arm's length, then later he paid more and more attention to the little girl. He started seeing his sister's features in Zoe's face. The dark hair that finally appeared on the top of her head was the same as Meg's. The confusion in Steve's soul was replaced by a warm, humble resignation. Once, when Zoe was 3 months old, she met her uncle with a smile, catching his index finger in her fist. And at this moment, Steve completely melted under the gaze of the little girl. It came to the point that the man, returning from work, started visiting the baby first. Rena was infuriated by this. "You spend too much time with this child," she grumbled unhappily, expressing her jealousy. "Come on, Rena, you're not jealous of the child, are you?" waved the man away. "She's my niece." "That's right, you're just her guardian," Rena cackled unhappily. "I hope you're not planning to adopt her." Steve preferred not to answer such silly questions. Naturally, the man became close with Faith as well. At first, they only discussed Zoe, but then they began to talk about everything. The young nurse turned out to be interesting and well-read. If Steve had the opportunity, they would sit for hours in the living room, discussing books and the latest news, listening to music, or discussing philosophical topics, like how much money a person needs to be happy. what a person should leave behind in this world, whether there are soulmates, and the eternal question of whether there is a meaning in life. They usually discussed these topics with enthusiasm while eating dinner that the man ordered from a restaurant, or that Faith cooked with her own hands if she had time. Faith did not know about cars, and Steve did not understand the subtleties of medicine at all. However, they both loved old movies and world history, and they argued passionately on various topics. Faith always said what she thought, not yielding to Steve, even though he was her boss. And he appreciated it. Steve couldn't even imagine how much he longed for such conversations. All his talks revolved around business, and Rena only talked about herself. Therefore, he found an outlet in Faith, the very soulmate they were talking about. Rena didn't want to sit at home, neither did she want to talk about the meaning of life. She didn't want pancakes for breakfast because she didn't eat gluten. She wanted a green vegetable smoothie and to go to a New York Fashion Week. Steve tried to indulge his fiancée, but she was getting crankier by the day. Later, the case took a more abrupt turn. When Zoe was already 6 months old, Rena began to complain to Steve that the nanny had taken her things. "She definitely tried on my dresses. These clothes don't hang like they did before, and they're all crumpled. And my eye cream, do you know how much it costs? Almost a fortune." "I don't think Faith needs your cream," thoughtfully said Steve, remembering the beautiful eyes of Faith like clear lakes. "And there is less perfume," claimed Rena. "We really don't know what she does at home in our absence." Steve only shook his head, but Rena did not give up, accusing Faith of more and more sins. For example, in the disappearance of jewellery. "I can't find my Cartier bracelet that you gave me. I've looked everywhere, but it's gone." "Maybe you left it in your apartment," assumed the man, still unwilling to believe the worst. "Or it fell somewhere." "Of course. I think it fell into the pocket of your precious nanny," frowned Rena, crossing her arms over her chest. "She probably already gave it to the pawn shop for nothing." Of course, Steve did not believe in it, considering it a coincidence. But there was a worm of doubt lodged in his soul. Rena's story was too confident. And Faith, he remembered, needed money. "Faith couldn't take it," Steve persisted. "But there's no one else. Do you think there is a ghost in the house?" "Good idea. Hire ghost hunters," Steve advised his fiancée because he got tired of this conversation. However, later small amounts of money had started disappearing from the man's coat pocket, wallet, and bedside table. Although he rarely used cash, it made it easier to spot when it was missing. "Yeah, I told you there would be no end of it," Rena coached her groom. "It's all your kindness, Steve. You warmed the real snake on your breast. You hire the poor and weak to work, and then they steal from you. That's the common story." Steve found it increasingly difficult to ignore the bride's words. He looked closely at Faith, but saw nothing in her kind, wonderful smile that Rena saw. The girl was sweet and sincere, and probably did not know the value of the Cartier bracelet. But she did say she needed the money, didn't she? One Sunday morning, when Steve allowed himself to sleep a little longer, he was awakened by a woman's screams. He jumped out of bed, wearing only his pajama pants, thinking in his sleep that something had happened to Zoe. Faith and Rena were standing facing each other. The nanny was pale, and Rena was purple with rage. "Steve!" she exclaimed with a triumphant voice, and raised her hand, revealing the shining trinket. "I found my bracelet. You know where? In the bag of baby stuff. She hid it there and was probably going to sell it." "I didn't take anything. It's the first time I've seen it." Faith raised her voice, and her chin trembled with resentment. Steve had not yet had time to shake off his sleepiness, and looked at the women with a frown. "It must be an accident." Oh, come on. You can't accidentally put someone else's thing in your bag, Rena insisted. Maybe she mistook it for a child's toy and took it with the other things. Steve shrugged his shoulders. I didn't take anything. Faith clenched her fists, turning white as a sheet. Why would I do that? Steve, say something, Rena demanded, stomping her foot. But the man didn't know whose side to take. Suddenly the thought about disappearing money came to his sleepy mind. He glanced at the frozen nanny, saying cautiously, Faith, if you need money urgently. The girl recoiled, and her eyes grew wider with shock. Steve faltered. The phone call distracted him from this conversation, without giving him a chance to explain himself. After talking to his colleague, he sat down with a sigh. They would have to solve this issue. Rena and Steve's wedding was only 3 months away, and it was clear Rena wouldn't get along with Faith. Maybe he should rent an apartment for the nanny and baby, but he didn't want to let Zoe go. And to be honest, he didn't want to let Faith go either. Steve was afraid to admit how much space in his soul this girl had taken. Thoughtlessly, Steve began to scroll through his phone, going to his fiancée's profile. He looked at their shared photos, realizing that not a single one showed him genuinely smiling. Rena was always dragging him around to flashy events like a trained monkey. Steve frowned. Just last night, his fiancée had met with her friends and posted some pictures. In one of them, she was captured with a cocktail in her hands. Suddenly, Steve saw the ill-fated bracelet on her wrist. Rena? He called his bride, and when she entered the bedroom, he asked, When did you notice the bracelet was missing? Rena was wearing the same dress as in the picture, smelled of hookah smoke and alcohol. She had probably just gotten back and sobered up, deciding to make another scene. Maybe a week ago? She shrugged her thin shoulders, covered in something shiny. You realize we can't let this go, right? Steve nodded. Of course. We'll have to apologize. Her apology is not enough for me. The girl jumped up. Rena, you don't understand me. It's you who have to apologize to Faith and make sure she forgives you for this prank. With these words, Steve showed her the picture with the bracelet. Tell me, was it you who stole the money? But why, Rena? Rena blinked incomprehensively and then burst into flames. Of course, she tried to lie and say that the picture was old and the bracelet was different. But Steve only waved away the implausible excuses. As a result, Rena slammed the door loudly and left the house. Steve went to Faith's room, and to his amazement, he saw that the nurse was packing her things into a suitcase. Zoe was lying on a child's mat, kicking the toys hanging above her. Faith, where are you going? Steve asked, startled, as he watched her fold her t-shirts neatly. She turned around over her shoulder and went back to her task, admitting honestly, I can't take it anymore. Don't worry, I'll work for a couple more days until you find a replacement, but no more. Something inside Steve shuddered and stirred, something that had long been slumbering in a man's chest. He felt an irresistible urge to rush to Faith, roughly snatch the suitcase, scatter her things, and leave them in this room, even on the floor. But he realized that this proud girl, if necessary, would go barefoot. She certainly wouldn't take change from his pocket or someone else's perfume. Steve felt incredibly ashamed that he had dared to doubt her, even for a moment. Faith, I'm sorry, he said, taking a step towards her. Don't make hasty decisions. It's my fault. It's just... His fists clenched and unclenched from the powerlessness that gripped him. He wanted only one thing, to hold her and never let her go. The girl didn't turn around. She froze. Her shoulders twitched as she took a deep, convulsive breath. My little sister is sick, she finally confessed. She has blood cancer and literally lives in the hospital, confined to IVs. It's the same diagnosis our dad had. That's probably why I went to medical school. That's why we need money for treatment, surgery and rehabilitation. Medications, They are expensive. We raise money through a charity fund, but I can't sit idly by. Mum can't work. She's always with her sister and Dad's gone. Chemotherapy helped him at first, but then his condition deteriorated. When the girl turned around, there were tears in her blue eyes, making them look even more like icy lakes. Her name is Dasha, Faith said, a slight smile appearing on her lips as she spoke of her sister. She's only 5 years old now. She didn't go to kindergarten, but she dreams of going to school, and I want that dream to come true. Maybe, if it would really save her, I'd steal your damn bracelet or the money, but I didn't. Why didn't you say all this to me the first time? Steve whispered. You think I wouldn't have helped? She shook her head, wiping away a tear. It's not your concern. Steve gently placed his palms on the girl's shoulders, pulling her close to him. At first, she tensed in his arms, as if thinking of recoiling. However, the girl surrendered. A sob escaped from her chest as she rested her chin on Steve's chest. Well, everything will be all right. He tried to comfort Faith, gently rubbing his palm over her back. The man did not suspect the strength that lay in those fragile shoulders, nor the pain that hid behind the gentle smile. Faith had mentioned that she loved caring for her younger sister, but she had never betrayed the tragedy of their family with a word or a look. Zoe rumbled as if she were displeased about something. Hearing this, the nanny sniffed, her nose reddening, and moved away from Steve. The man realized that he didn't want to let her go. The girl raised her head and wiped the salty tears from her face, smiling. Don't go away, okay? Steve asked from the bottom of his heart. I'll feel bad without you. The girl's eyes opened, and her face froze in doubt. Steve cleared his throat and corrected himself. I can't cope with Zoe, and she's already used to you. You tamed me too with your blueberry pancakes, Faith, and we are responsible for those we tame, remember? He chuckled, trying to cope with the boyish excitement he hadn't felt in so long. He was telling the truth, but not the whole truth. Steve no longer wanted to come to the empty house. He liked going back to the place where Faith and Zoe lived. For the first time, he was rushing to get rid of business and be in the cozy living room, where the baby was sleeping and the nanny was reading a book. It was the first time he'd walked with them in the backyard of his own house, where he'd only ever looked out the window at the fruit trees. With them, he ignored his schedule, wanting to fill every line of the day planner with the names of these two people who had burst into his life so suddenly. Now it seemed to him that the sensitive Faith, who looked into his face with her deep gaze, was reading his soul. She saw what he dared not say. The man drew himself forward, not realizing what he intended to say or even do. But then the doorbell rang. Steve sighed, realizing that the call had saved him from making a mistake. He could not do this to Rena or Faith. He needed to sort himself out first. He went to the door, though he wasn't expecting visitors on a Sunday morning. On the threshold stood a man he did not know. Steve didn't like the look of him at once. A slippery type. He could smell them a mile away, and did not hire them. May I help you? Steve raised his eyebrows. The stranger smiled broadly. Are you Steve Barrow? Waiting for a nod, the stranger opened his arms. Well, meet your relatives. You've either been drinking since morning, or you've made a mistake. Steve glared at the blonde man. The stranger grinned disappointedly, dropping his hands. Okay, let me into the house first, or shall we talk on the doorstep? Steve did not move from his seat. Then the man pulled out his trump card. The fact is that you have my daughter, dear brother-in-law. These words made Steve tighten his grip on the doorknob. What? He hoped he had misheard. Meg carried my child under her heart. It took me a while to find out too. When I started looking for my baby, I found out you'd taken her. I had to make inquiries, but here I am. I didn't introduce myself. Harvey Harris, and yes, I apologize for our mutual loss. Meg was a beautiful girl. She graced this world. But God takes the best to himself. Saying this, the man shook his head dejectedly. Only his misery was not to be believed. He was like Rena. Only he played even lousier. Steve ignored the outstretched palm, but let the stranger into the house. Harvey looked around, taking in the space, occasionally whistling and commenting on the interior. Do you need a child? Steve immediately came to the point. Do you want to become a single father? And you? Harvey answered the question with a question. Do you need her? Steve did not understand what this man was getting at. Meanwhile, Harvey was wandering around the living room, taking in his hands the statuettes arranged by the designer decorator. Steve realized that a little more and he would throw this man out of his house. But his brain had already calculated that the law would probably be on his father's side, not Uncle's. Today, on this sunny Sunday morning, Steve clearly realized two things. He didn't want to let Faith go, and he won't give Zoe to anyone either. It took a long time for you to come for your daughter, he said. Why didn't you call before coming? Harvey crossed his arms on his chest. I prefer to solve such serious issues in person, face to face. You're a businessman, you must understand. You have a lot of money, don't you? Steve, already tired of the dances around the main, interrupted Harvey. What do you want? The man finally stopped fooling around and said, I need a sponsor. He set the candlestick aside and looked into Steve's eyes. You see, I'm a car racer, and you're the perfect sponsor for a young talent like me. Steve shook his head. Harvey gritted his teeth, and his face took on a beastly expression for a moment. However, he quickly suppressed his arrogance and smiled. Everyone has ups and downs. I had a sponsor, but we didn't get along. There was a scandal, just a misunderstanding, but it did a lot of damage to my reputation, he explained reluctantly. Steve mentally made a note to check what the story was. So you and my sister. Steve pushed his guest in the right direction of the conversation. Oh yes, Meg and I had a wonderful relationship. We'd been dating for a year, and we were planning to get married. But I was away at a competition. I was hoping to sign a contract, and then we would have gotten married. But fate had it differently. When I came back, I learned about the tragedy that happened. She talked about you, by the way, promised that you will help me. I could say that this was her last wish. Steve clenched his teeth. He didn't believe a word that this sly guy said. Why do you want a child? He asked. You didn't hear me, dear brother-in-law. Harvey waved his hands. I don't need a child. I need a sponsor and money. Then I will be silent. I will not claim paternity, and this baby will have a good life with his own uncle, and I'll have a good fortune. Everybody's happy. Otherwise, well, I'll go to court. I'll prove our kinship, take the girl to my hometown. But what will happen to her there, I don't know. Harvey's words were a blatant threat. He stood in Steve's living room and threatened a 6-month-old baby. Blood boiled in Steve's veins like lava. He almost lunged at Harvey, about to grab him by the breasts and pull him on the fireplace, which he was so diligently looking at. Except Steve didn't have time. There was a startled shriek from beside them, and then something shattered. Both men turned their faces sharply towards the stairs. Faith was coming down from there. She was carrying an empty glass, and it slipped from her weakened fingers and fell at her bare feet, shattering into transparent fragments. Steve saw the sharp pieces of glass fell directly on her fingers, but the girl did not even pay attention to it. Her gaze, frightened, was fixed on the guest. Harvey, too, seemed to be extremely puzzled by such an encounter. He was as dazed as the girl. "Oh, Faith," he muttered, trying to come to his senses. The girl swallowed noisily. The colour drained from her face and her fingers trembled. She was like a little rabbit that froze in front of a snake. "Steve," Faith whispered fearfully, "what is he doing here?" The man resolutely did not understand what was happening. However, he felt a keen desire to protect Faith. "Do you know each other?" He shifted his gaze from the guy to the nurse. "Oh, sort of. We crossed our paths," sparingly remarked Harvey, and he looked at Faith so expressively that she recoiled. "You know, I have to go now. Think about my offer, brother-in-law. I'm waiting for a call." He took out a business card from his pocket with a picture of a motorcycle and put it on a low black glass table. Then he threw another biting glance at the nanny. "See you later, Faith. Shall I say hello from you to your mum or little sister when I pass by?" he asked softly. Faith clenched her hands into fists but remained silent. Steve again heard a threat in Harvey's tone. What did he allow himself? "Don't see me off." Harvey waved and walked out of the house. As soon as the door shut behind him, Faith immediately rushed to Steve. "He's a terrible man," she exclaimed. "Don't believe him, no matter what he says." Then she gave a gasp and stumbled backwards. Steve picked up the girl just in time and sat her down on the sofa. A long and thin splinter was embedded in the soft skin of her foot. Carefully he removed it and treated the wound with a first aid kit. Faith remained silent throughout, only mentioning that Zoe had fallen asleep. "How do you know him?" the man asked when the glass shards had been thrown away and her leg was feeling better. Faith lowered her head, her two blonde braids falling down the sides of her face. She began, but couldn't continue. She seemed to want to spill the whole truth, but was wary of the man. "Harvey," Steve began cautiously, "he is Zoe's father, or at least that's what he said." Faith gave a frightened gasp and then, panting and jumping from one thing to another, told the story that Harvey had mentioned. When Faith turned 18, she had allowed herself to have fun with her friends. They met a group of guys who seemed cool because they drove motorbikes and wore leather coats. The guys invited them to continue the party at their place, but Faith initially refused. Her friends begged her not to break the buzz and claimed that adulthood comes once in a lifetime. Under the pressure of their requests, Faith gave in, but said that she had only an hour. She was already tired from dancing and was falling off her feet. The guys put them on their motorbikes and took them to a house on the outskirts. Faith had the chance to ride with Harvey, who paid attention to the birthday girl all evening. "I can't explain what happened in the house," admitted Faith, clasping her fingers. "I didn't drink. You know, I didn't drink at their place either. When I wanted to leave, he proposed a toast in my honor and gave me a glass of juice. He asked me to drink it all down. When I drank the juice, the world just shook. In the morning, I woke up naked in bed with him. My phone was off because my mum had called it 1,000,000 times. I felt awful. And he said it was my fault, that I knew where I was going, and if the girl accepts an invitation from a guy to his apartment, you know what you're getting into. But I didn't, I swear." Faith clenched her hands so tightly that there were nail marks on her skin. Steve put his palm on her knuckles in an attempt to calm her down. "But that's not the end of it, right?" Steve asked. Faith shook her head. "He threw me money for a cab and told me to get out. I found the dress. The straps were torn off, and he definitely put a notch on the bed. He said I was his Jubilee fool. Only that wasn't all. I was just leaving when he grabbed my chin, hard and painful. He looked into my eyes and told me that if I opened my mouth, everyone would see what I did last night. He said he took a video and would definitely put it on the websites. Faith took a deep breath and then exhaled noisily. She released her hands from Steve's palms, rubbing her face. She didn't cry anymore. I didn't know what to do. My friends told me to forget about it. And I couldn't. I felt dirty, humiliated. So I went to the police and filed a report. But it was too late and to no avail. Faith shook her head, continuing bitterly. Did you know that winning such a case is almost unrealistic? In today's world, it is easier for people to condemn the victim than the abuser. I was told that I provoked a prominent race car driver, that I made up the abuse story, and that I had kept quiet for too long. I couldn't prove anything, but the sponsors turned their backs on him, because even if it was slander, his reputation was already tarnished. Nobody wanted to get dirty. Then Harvey was furious with me, and then he suddenly disappeared, and I breathed a sigh of relief. And now I've seen him again. My God. Faith shook her head again, not believing what was happening. Steve was infinitely sorry for the fragile girl who had experienced such a thing. However, his brain was already analysing what he had heard. Steve was shocked. He couldn't help but think about his sister's silence regarding her pregnancy, and he didn't believe in the fairy tale of a grand and pure love between his sweet sister and this guy. But he did believe Faith's words. Without realising it, he leaned over and kissed Faith on the temple. Don't expect me for dinner tonight, and lock the doors, just in case, he said one last time. He had already lost Meg. He wouldn't lose Faith and Zoe, and he certainly wouldn't put his sister's child in the hands of such a man. Rena barged into Steve's office without knocking, ignoring the indignant secretary. Steve, I know you're busy playing the Blood Avenger, but we have to try the wedding cakes this evening. We can't put it off any more, she said in a business-like tone, sitting down in the chair opposite. Steve looked up from the papers the lawyer had brought. The lawyer was a real pro, so there was no doubt they would win the case. The only question was how long they would put this car racer behind bars. The deeper they dug, the more they found. They managed to find other victims, terrified girls just like Faith. When they gave their statements, the police had to search the guy's apartment. They took his computer, laptop, and everything else. That's how investigators found the videos he kept as trophies and, in some cases, as a means of blackmail. Steve's heart broke when he was informed that his sister was also in those videos. However, he now believed that his poor, tired sister might have stepped in front of the car. She must have been at the end of her rope. Steve also blamed himself. How did he not notice? Of course he couldn't change the past, but he could avenge his sister and honour her memory by putting her abuser in jail. The trial started a month ago and was set for this weekend. Steve and Rena made up after she came over and apologised to Faith. She wrung her hands, cried, and explained that she was terribly jealous, but only because she was madly in love with Steve. Steve was already busy with the court case, so he didn't think a lot why they were preparing for the wedding again. "What time?" Steve asked humbly, setting the folder aside. "At 7, the bride replied, beaming. "At the Eclair, French pastry shop in the centre." Steve nodded absent-mindedly, thinking about how Zoe was feeling. The little girl had been sick for the past few days. Faith was coping, but it was evident that she was worried too. The doctors couldn't determine what was wrong with the baby. They said it was colic, but only Faith doubted it. Zoe frequently cried, turned pale, wheezed, experienced shortness of breath, and had diarrhea. "You know, "When you and the nanny go to court, I'll sit with Zoe," said the bride, admiring her freshly manicured nails. Steve blinked, surprised by Rena's sensitivity and offer to help. "Seriously?" he asked again. Rena shrugged. "I'm not a terrible person, Steve. Yes, I'm not thrilled about the child, but since the girl comes along with you, I'll try to accept it." "Are you sure you can handle it?" Steve asked cautiously. "Don't worry about that. I'll faint at the sight of a diaper. And besides, I want you to realize that I value you, Steve." She leaned across the table and touched his hand with hers, which was icy cold. "I'm on your side and I love you. Do you hear me? If it's important to you, it's important to me too. However, the baby and the nanny are not coming on the wedding trip, so don't get your hopes up." Rena laughed merrily. Steve smiled absent-mindedly, accepting her help. However, he still couldn't give up the idea of hiring a nanny to assist his bride. The judge hit the gavel on a special stand to declare the court session closed. The verdict was now in effect, and they had won. Steve looked at Faith, who was smiling happily at him. Two girls who had not known each other before this meeting embraced each other crying. Maybe the freak could intimidate them individually, but together they turned into a force that crushed him. Steve's soul was still dreary because Meg was not there, but it had gotten a little easier. He hoped that his sister felt a little better too. "Well, let's go home now, shall we?" Steve smiled, hugging Faith's shoulders in a friendly way as they left the stuffy courtroom. "Home," nodded the girl easily. "To Zoe, I'm so worried. She's been much better lately, but still, I'm not used to being without her for so long." Something in Steve's stomach turned over when he realized how easily they both called the same place home, and how attached they had become to little Zoe. As they drove home upbeat, Steve received a call from Rena. He jabbed at the speakerphone while continuing to drive. "Rena, we are already driving home." However, he heard the girl sobbing in response, and his heart sank into the heels. We're in the hospital, Steve," Rena said this while crying. "Zoe got sick again like before, but I didn't know what to do. I'm not a nurse. I called an ambulance. She was vomiting, you know. I was so scared, Steve." The man swerved the steering wheel, turning the car around. He pressed the gas pedal to the floor, rushing to the hospital. "What on earth is this?" he reasoned, clutching the steering wheel tightly. Barely something gets better, at least a little bit, as again fate gives a kick. God, let her be all right. "Steve, everything will be all right, do you hear?" Faith whispered quietly, as if answering his thoughts. He only nodded sternly. They arrived at the hospital, miraculously avoiding an accident. The man regarded the red traffic signals with such indignation, as if he himself were the doctor who could save his child's life. Of course, Zoe was his daughter now. How could she not be? The doctors greeted the worried uncle with good news. "The child is in a serious condition, but everything will be fine," the doctor said. "We are doing research to understand what caused her illness." Steve exhaled, squatting down in the hallway. "Where's Rena?" he asked. "The woman who came with the baby." "She wasn't feeling well. We sedated her and took her to the room," a nurse answered instead of the doctor. "I'll show you out." Steve turned to Faith in indecision, but she nodded with a smile. "I'll stay here." The man followed the nurse. When he entered the dark ward, he found no one. Then he heard water pouring from the tap in the toilet and realized that Rena was there. For some reason, he thought that the girl was crying, having gone through such stress. Steve went to the door, but he didn't have time to knock when he heard her cheerful laughter. It was not like the laughter of a frightened woman. "Did he believe me?" Rena grinned, talking to someone on the phone. "The whole staff believed me. It was Oscar-worthy, believe me. I wish I was still in Hollywood. But I got a small start, right?" Steve stood outside the door, listening to the bride's angry words on the phone. "No, I won't let him adopt this little brat. His sister's offspring won't get anything from my husband's estate, I swear. I just overdosed today, so I'll have to lie low, so I don't arouse suspicion in the future. But I won't stop. I've got enough arsenic. I'll save some for the babysitter too. She's so annoying. Do you know what Steve did? He's paying for her sister's treatment. He's also organising a charity race to raise money for it." Steve turned white as he heard this. Suddenly, he thought about when the child's bout of malaise began. It seems like it had been a while since Rena started living with him again, since she started paying more attention to Zoe. He remembered once that she even fed the child mashed vegetables. "Steve is my lucky ticket," Rena continued. "When we broke up, I slept with one director, and what do you think? He turned out to be a rare goat. And Steve has money, and soon they will all belong to me. Okay, baby, come on. He'll be here soon, and I want to wipe off my makeup, so I look nice and pretty. Kisses." Steve took a step back, moving away from the door. He took out his smartphone and dialed the number of the lawyer with whom they had won the case just 2 hours ago. "Hi. We have one more case." Steve breathed in the fresh, iodized air deeply. He looked out at the azure sea, the waves caressing the snow-white sand. The day was marvelous. He turned off his phone, allowing himself to fully enjoy his vacation. The children's laughter caught his attention. 3-year-old Zoe was frightened to get too close to the waves, but with puppy-like delight, she ran back seconds later. Faith encouraged her, filming on her phone. Steve stared, mesmerizing at his spouse. His wife had been glowing with happiness for the last few days, not just because her sister had recovered, not just because they were happily married. Steve shifted his gaze lower, looking at the spouse's barely rounded belly. God, how beautiful she was. The woman, being pregnant, just glowed from within. Looking at how Faith was helping Zoe build a sandcastle, the man thought he hadn't realized the value of family until he lost it. He didn't realize how much he wanted a family of his own until he met one. It was as if it were only after taking a bite of a delicate dessert that he realized how much he really loved it. Now, he would definitely not change his family for business. However, now one did not interfere with the other. Faith became not only a caring mother and wife, but also a real support and help for Steve in work matters. It is safe to say that they had travelled a thorny path to their happiness, and Steve hoped that now only happiness and success awaited them. "Steve!" shouted his wife, waving her hand. "Come, help us dig a ditch with water." She fixed a Panama hat on their daughter's head, who looked like Meg. "Daddy!" demanded the little girl, waving her hands with wet sand. "The chief builder is coming, girls," he declared, belligerently arming himself with a green plastic spatula and a pink bucket. "Now, I will build you such a castle that you will want to live in it." Zoe greeted the idea with delight, clapping her hands. Steve smiled happily. Yes, there was only joy and success ahead, and no other way.